So I had this Disneyland trip planned with the family this last weekend, kind of an annual tradition where we always go around Christmas time. And I decided to rent this, the Olympus E-M5 III to take with me. Now, this is a camera that caught my eye as checking a lot of the perfect camera boxes. And when I say perfect camera, I kind of mean it in the camera conspiracy sense, which is really a perfect vlogging or YouTube camera. You know, it's small and it's lightweight. It's got amazing stabilization. It has good autofocus. And of course, it has that screen that flips to the side. Now, the reason I rented it instead of buying it is, one, I'm a little bit apprehensive about the Micro Four Thirds ecosystem. And two, it's pretty expensive compared to the competition. And we'll get into that value proposition at the end of the video. But regarding my feelings on Micro Four Thirds, so back in the day, I guess it's the second camera that I owned was a Panasonic GH4. And although I got some good shots and I used it for a little bit of video, I was always troubled by its low light and its autofocus performance. However, at the time, I wasn't really spending that much money on camera gear, and I didn't have great lenses to go with it. I also had no clue what I was doing regarding focal lengths and how they're affected by crop factors with smaller sensors. So I found myself being frustrated that I could never shoot as wide as I would like. So anyway, I eventually sold my GH4. I bought this A7 III, and I swore after the low light and autofocus performance of the A7 III that I would never use Micro Four Thirds again. And you know, given the state of autofocus within the Micro Four Thirds ecosystem, I never really second guessed that decision. At least not until Olympus released a firmware update for the EM1 Mark II over the summer that enabled phase detection autofocus while in video mode. Fast forward a couple months later, the EM5 Mark III was announced with the same autofocus features in a smaller package, and I kind of knew I wanted to test it out and maybe revisit the Micro Four Thirds ecosystem, this time using some higher end lenses. So with this trip coming up, figured it would be a good opportunity to rent one and try it out. Now, as a stills camera, straight off the bat, I'll tell you, I didn't really like it. To that end, I took about 450 shots over 2 days, but only a couple of video clips. And for reference, about 95% of those shots were taken with the Panasonic 12mm f1.4, and the rest of the time with the 25mm Olympus f1.8. Now, it wasn't all bad. You know, there's a few things that I liked about it, and I did get some keepers, as I've kind of been showing you over the last few seconds. You know, the fully articulating screen was nice to be able to get a couple of interesting angles. And of course, the sensor stabilization, even in stills mode, came in handy. I was able to get a couple of good shots handheld with a relatively slow shutter. For example, here's a shot from inside one of the new Star Wars rides taken at 1/4 of a second, shutter speed at ISO 6400. Now, if we zoom in, sure, it's noisy as all hell, but look at how sharp those buttons and dials are. As for video features I liked, keeping with stabilization, it's frankly incredible. It's the best stabilization of any camera that I've ever used. And if you really want the smoothest footage possible without a gimbal, you know, it might be worth picking it up just for that. I'll kind of talk about that at the end of the video. And other good video features, it has better codec for 4K as it can record over 200 megabits per second. And when you're shooting in 4K in 24p, you can record in Cinema 4K, which gives you an extra 256 pixels horizontally. And when you're shooting in 24 frames per second, you can also set a shutter speed of exactly 1/48 of a second to achieve that perfect 180-degree roll. Probably doesn't really make a perceptible difference from the 50 frames per second available in most other cameras, but it's still a nice touch. But on the downside, you know, the battery life was kind of meh. I think I only got maybe 250 shots the first day before it died on me in the mid-afternoon. And since I was renting it, I didn't have any spare batteries with me. But obviously, if I owned it, that wouldn't be the case, so I don't really want to knock it there. Another thing, you know, it kind of feels cheap compared to the competition. If you pick it up next to the M6 Mark II, you know, even though the Olympus feels lighter, it doesn't feel as satisfying to hold. Like the materials aren't as premium, I guess. And, you know, even without the viewfinder, it's actually slightly bigger than the M6 Mark II. In basically every dimension, it's a little bit thicker, it's a little bit taller, you know, shoulder to shoulder, it's a little bit taller. So yeah, you know, you're getting that smaller sensor, but you're not really getting a size benefit. It's not a more compact system. And now we get to the real cons, or the issues that I had with the camera, and it mostly has to do with the quirks around its ISO handling. Now, my preferred shooting mode is aperture priority with auto ISO, and that created a couple of problems for me. First, when in auto ISO mode, it seems to limit itself to only 6400 ISO. Now, as we saw in the image earlier, you probably don't want to go much higher than that anyway, but the result is I was getting some really slow shutter speeds, especially indoors. I ended up with a lot of shots that were completely unusable because they were just too blurry because the shutter speed was so slow. Now, it's hard to say, would it have been more usable at ISO 12,800? I don't know, but it would have been nice to find out. Many others have mentioned there's no auto ISO in movie mode. That created some problems for me when I was trying to shoot some video. You know, as things move from dark to light, you had to manually go in and bump up the ISO. And then the last thing regarding ISO that I've kind of already alluded to is that as a micro four thirds sensor, it's a little bit smaller and the high ISO performance was about as poor as expected. You know, to that end, I went ahead and did a little high ISO test comparing it with the Sony A6600. And this is the rig that I used in order to set that up. I've got the Sigma 16mm f1.4 on the Sony A6600, and in order to create the same field of view on the Micro Four Thirds Olympus, I've got the Panasonic 12mm f1.4. I did leave the noise reduction on both cameras to their default settings, which in the menu on the Olympus is referred to as standard, and on the Sony is referred to as normal. So let's go ahead and look at the footage. Both cameras are set to 1/50th of a second shutter speed, both shooting at 24 frames per second, both in 4K, both with the lenses set to an aperture of f1.4. Both cameras are currently set to an ISO of 200, so this will be our base. We have a single light source in this room. It's the Aperture 120D Mark II. I'll be dialing it down using this remote. Let's get going. This is currently ISO 200. Okay, this is ISO 400. We've got ISO 400 on each camera. Here we are at ISO 800. We've got ISO 800 on each camera. This is ISO 1600. We've got ISO 1600 on each camera. All right, we are now at ISO 3200. ISO 3200 in each camera. All right, here we are at ISO 6400. We've got ISO 6400 on each camera, and this will actually be the end of the test because it doesn't seem like I can increase the ISO any further while in video mode on the Olympus. So that's interesting to note. Okay, we're back. I checked out the footage between the two cameras and it's about what I expected. I mean, the Olympus is a lot noisier. I was actually surprised it was during that test that I realized that I couldn't increase the ISO any higher than 6400 when shooting in video mode. But, you know, if you look at how noisy that was really getting, you probably wouldn't want to shoot much higher than that anyway. I kind of noticed that the Olympus looked pretty good up there about ISO maybe 1600. And since we have this same rig ready to go, why don't we go ahead and take it outside and do a little stabilization comparison between these two cameras. You know, here I expect the Olympus to completely destroy the A6600, especially when we're walking. Now, I should note that in this test, I'm using just the sensor shift stabilization in the Olympus, not the sensor shift combined with the digital image stabilization. And I did that because with 12mm on Micro Four Thirds, it's already cropped in a little bit tight for vlogging, and I didn't want to add that extra crop that the digital image stabilization would have added. So let's go ahead and check out the test. Okay, here's a little walking test. Not trying to walk terribly steady, just walking and filming the horizon. Here's a little panning test. Here's a walking test that's like focused on one subject. Okay, here's what it looks like if we turn the camera around for a little vlogging comparison. We've got the Olympus over here on the right. We got the Sony A6600 over here on my left. Both cameras are set to 1/50th of a second shutter speed. Both lenses are set to f5.6. Both are shooting at ISO 200. Both have a 24mm full frame equivalent focal length with the Panasonic 12mm f1.4 on the Olympus, and the Sony has the Sigma 16mm f1.4. So given the two cameras crop sizes, 2x crop on the Olympus because it's Micro Four Thirds, and 1.5x crop on the Sony because it's APS-C, you get 24mm full frame equivalent on both lenses. So I looked at the footage and sure enough, the A6600 still sucks at stabilizing walking footage. But as I discussed in an earlier video, I thought the A6600 did a good job in the panning test. You know, it'd certainly be usable for getting some B-roll. I thought the difference in white balance was interesting between the A6600, coming in a lot warmer, even though, you know, both cameras were set to auto white balance. And to be honest, I actually kind of like the image coming out of the Olympus more, although it also appears to be overly sharpened. So if I was going to keep the camera, I'd probably turn down the in-camera sharpening for a future video. Now, I was using the default picture profiles in both cameras, and at least in that test, the Olympus appears to have a little bit more dynamic range. Take a look at this shot and look at the tree and the swing set in the background. You can see that it's a lot less blown out on the Olympus. However, it could just be that the A6600 ended up with a hotter image for whatever reason. Again, I had both cameras set to the same ISO, same f-stop, and same shutter speed. However, if I bring up the video scopes, you can see that the exposure was in fact a tad higher on the Sony. Plus the Sony has log picture profiles, which the EM5 does not. So if I was shooting something like this for real in such a high dynamic range situation, I'd probably be using HLG or S-Log2 on the Sony, in which case I would expect that the Sony would absolutely destroy the Olympus in terms of dynamic range. All right, let's spend a little bit of time talking about the value of this EM5. And I think that's my biggest problem with this camera. At $1,200, I don't really understand the value proposition. Now, what I generally see argued in favor of Micro Four Thirds is the following. You get compact cameras and lenses with great lens selection at low cost and, well, as a throw in, with great stabilization. So let's take those one at a time, starting with the compact cameras and lenses. For comparison, let's take a look at the Canon M6 II. You know, it's just as compact of a system. The body is actually a little bit smaller than the EM5 in many of the dimensions, certainly in the height of the camera. It costs $350 less, has a bigger sensor, and I think it has better features for photographers, starting with that 32 megapixel sensor compared to the 20 megapixel sensor that's in the Olympus. Now, the EM5 is probably a better video camera due to its amazing stabilization, better codecs, and the ability to shoot in 24 frames per second. Still waiting on that firmware update, Canon. Next, let's take a look at the fabled lens selection for the Micro Four Thirds system. And generally I'd agree, except if you like to shoot fast and wide like I do. With that 2x crop, there's really only 2 lenses in the entire ecosystem that have autofocus, are faster than f2, and are 24 millimeter or wider full frame equivalent. One of those lenses is this one right here, which is the Panasonic 12 millimeter f1.4, which is pretty close in size, weight, and cost as the full frame Sony 24 millimeter 1.4 GM. The other lens that fits that criteria is the Panasonic 10 to 25 millimeter f1.7, which is as big as a full frame 16 to 35 2.8 and costs almost $2,000. Now that said, the 20 to 50 millimeter full frame equivalent zoom range that lens provides is kind of my dream focal range on a fast zoom. If something like that came out for APS-C or full frame, I would absolutely be all over it. But my point is, if you want to shoot fast and wide, you're limited to 2 very expensive and not so compact lenses. And if all you do is shoot in good lighting and you don't want a shallow depth of field, that cell phone that's already in your pocket does a pretty good job at those things. So finally, let's talk about the low cost proposition. As we've seen, if you want fast and wide, you're already paying a premium. Plus, the Olympus EM5 Mark II is pretty pricey on its own, especially compared to the competition. Let's suppose you want to shoot 24 millimeter full frame equivalent at f1.4. The Panasonic 12 millimeter 1.4 and the Olympus EM5 Mark III together would run you $2,200. By comparison, the Sony A6600 and the Sigma 16 millimeter f1.4 would run you only $1,600. And in my opinion, the A6600 is hands down a better video camera. It's got better autofocus, it's got log profiles, better battery life, no record limit, auto ISO and video mode, and better overall video ISO performance. Now I will say this, the EM5 III is a better daytime vlogging camera. The stabilization is incredible, and I actually prefer the look straight out of camera with the default picture profile without needing to do any grading. And the screen flipping to the side means it won't block your microphone. And if your lighting is pretty consistent during the day, middle of the day you're outside, there aren't a lot of clouds in the sky, then you don't need auto ISO in video mode. And to that end, I could actually see myself buying an EM5 Mark III eventually. However, it's such a niche use case, that daytime outdoor vlogging, that I would actually want to wait until it inevitably comes down in price. So for reference, the EM5 Mark II has been available from Olympus's outlet store for as little as $550. And at that price, I think I'd be all over the Mark III. So that's kind of my thoughts on the EM5 Mark III. If you have any questions or if you have any comments, leave them down below. One thing that's nice about having such a small channel like this is I actually have the opportunity to read almost every single comment and answer a lot of the questions that people have, or just pop down there and say hi. But if not, then I'll see you in the next video. Be sure to subscribe. Thanks so much. Bye.